And Paul's readers in the first century Mediterranean world, where they've got olive trees all over the place, they knew this. And they knew that grafting a wild olive branch into a cultivated tree was just contrary to nature, and it would not produce fruit, and it would likely damage the cultivated tree, which makes Paul's metaphor here even more powerful. Because he says to us Gentiles, you're the wild olive tree. You're the wild olive branch. You're a bunch of wild Gentiles that God has grafted into his cultivated tree. You're a bunch of wild Gentiles whose only previous fruit that you produced in your life was bad fruit. Terrible fruit. And God takes that wild Gentile, that wild olive branch, and he's going to graft that wild Gentile into the cultivated tree. He's going to graft that wild Gentile into a relationship with God. And for the reader, this analogy of the wild olive into a cultivated olive tree, that's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. You're gonna ruin what God has established with his people. If you bring a bunch of wild Gentiles in who don't know God, a bunch of uncircumcised Gentiles, no relationship with God, no history with God, no knowledge of the covenants, no knowledge of the promises, no knowledge of his word, bunch of pagans, bunch of heathens, bunch of immoral people, you're going to bring them into the cultivated tree? You're going to ruin everything by doing that. Do you remember in the book of Acts when Gentiles started getting saved? Remember how the Jewish believers responded? They were shocked. They were shocked that God would save Gentiles. And I think it's in like about Acts chapter 11 when Peter is recounting how the Holy Spirit fell on the Gentiles and the Gentiles were saved. And it says that the Jewish believers sat in silence for a moment. They just fell silent after hearing that Gentiles were getting saved the same way. They didn't expect God to save Gentiles and add them to the church because, after all, they're Gentiles. They're heathens. They don't know God. Do you remember in the book of Acts when Peter entered the house of Cornelius, a Gentile? Remember what Peter said? I'm not even supposed to enter the house of a Gentile. As a Jew, I'm not even supposed to come into your house because you're a Gentile. Again, Gentiles who don't know God, who don't know his covenants, who don't know his promises, who don't know his law, don't have his word, no history with God, separated from God, far from God, it says in Ephesians, far away from God, without God, with no hope in the world. And God saves them, Gentiles, us, by his grace, and he grafts wild Gentiles into this cultivated olive tree against nature, something contrary to nature, where people would look at that and think the Gentiles are just going to corrupt the whole thing. They're going to mess up the whole thing. But instead, Gentiles became partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Gentiles, we come in now and we're just soaking it up, right? We're soaking up the Old Testament covenants and the promises and the law and the scriptures and the word, and we love them. We love all the imagery and the typology and the pictures of Jesus and the Old Testament, and we're just growing and we're just, have vitality and life from all of the root and the fatness of the Old Testament covenants and the promises. We wild Gentiles. And now, because we partake of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, and we partake of the covenants and the promises that God made to Israel, now wild Gentiles are bearing good fruit unto God. Amazing. Never expected that. Never expected wild Gentiles to bear fruit unto God. And it should provoke the Jews to jealousy to see that. Now here's one of the things I want you to see here with this passage. And it's so key, so important for us as Gentile Christians. Again, I think that's probably most of us here, if not all of us here. We Gentiles have been grafted into something that God started with Israel. You know, the majority of the church is Gentiles. And so we may have this mentality that if a Jewish person believes in Jesus Christ, well, they're grafted into us. They've joined the church. They've joined us. No, we've been grafted into something that God started with Israel. We've been given the privilege of partaking in something that God established with Israel and with the Jewish people. He didn't establish covenants and promises with us. He made the covenants and promises with Israel and to the Jewish people. God gave His word to Israel. Even the new covenant that we celebrated today through taking communion and commemorated through communion, God made the new covenant with Israel, not really the church. God made the new covenant with Israel. Jeremiah 31:31, God says the new covenant He will make with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not the house of Gentiles. God makes the new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah, and now we're just grafted into this thing, contrary to nature, and we're able to partake of the new covenant that God made with Judah and Israel.